I was born in rural Georgia in 1957 in a landscape that seemed painted from another century. Fields of cotton and corn stretched under a relentless sun, and back roads wound between weathered farmhouses like threads through patchwork quilts. Our little town had a single stoplight, two gas stations, and a courthouse where every Friday folks lined up to gossip on the steps. My earliest memories are of Sunday mornings, the wooden pews of our whitewashed church, creaking under hymnals, my mother in her crisp, starched dress, my father tipping his hat to neighbours before disappearing into the pulpit as the choir lifted its voices to heaven. It all felt so orderly beautiful. Even but beneath that calm surface, old traditions ruled every corner of life. Georgia, in the late 1950s, was still healing from the scars of the Civil War and wrestling with its Jim Crow laws. Schools were segregated. My black classmates sat crowded in the back rooms with outdated textbooks, while we white children kept our desks neat and our hands folded. The women I saw, my mother, my aunts, the church ladies, moved through the world with quiet dignity, their voices soft and their opinions rarely spoken beyond the kitchen walls. They ran households, raised children, and cooked meals from scratch, yet they were expected to defer to men whenever he spoke. Girls don't need to know more than they want to, my father would say as he flipped through his county payroll register, his voice final. At 10 years old, I didn't understand why I had to lower my eyes when he spoke to me, or why my mother frowned when I corrected the preacher's mispronunciation of a Bible verse. These customs felt invisible, like the air I breathed, until I stepped outside their invisible boundaries. By the early 1960s, whispers of change drifted through even our tight-knit world. TV brought the civil rights movement into our living rooms, and I watched on black and white screens as brave men and women challenged segregation. Yet in our home, the rule remained. Girls must be polite, quiet, and never question their place. I excelled at school, earning top grades, but each report card was delivered with a cautionary glance. "Don't let that sharp tongue get the best of you," warned my mother, as though my success were dangerous. I learned quickly to hush my thoughts, to smile agreeably, even when my heart raged with questions. It was considered a virtue to be well-mannered, but what it really meant was to hide your mind. Behind closed doors, the old Southern conviction that a woman's place was at home took on a darker tone. My father, once a gentleman in church, would return from the county seat with a flask hidden in his coat pocket. The pleasant evening stories around the dinner table, candy for me and my little brother, sometimes morphed into angry shouting as the alcohol took over. Plates crashed onto the floor. My mother pressed her fingers to her temple to stave off the pounding in her head. We children learned to become invisible, to press our backs against the wall and hold our breath until calm returned like a wavering lullaby. "You two sit quietly," she'd whisper, "or he'll think you're mocking him." I taught myself at age 9 how to stay small. In those days, domestic violence was never spoken of outside the parlour. It was seen as a private matter, my mother's shame to bear alone, my father's right to rule his household. When my cousin's mother left my uncle, she was quietly shunned at church. No one offered help, no one mentioned counsellors or hotlines. And yet we children felt its deep impact. By age 12, I was prone to sudden anxiety. I'd flinch at a raised voice, startle at the crack of a cupboard door. I developed nightmares in which shadows morphed into angry shapes, and I'd wake drenched in sweat, my heart hammering like a frightened bird. The flames of that fear, fanned quietly over years, became part of me, a hidden scar. Looking back, I see how these unspoken rules, girls must be demure, violence must be hidden, wove themselves into the fabric of my identity. I carried shame I never asked for, silence that choked my voice, and a sense that no matter how brightly I shone, I had to dim my light so as not to disturb the dark. Yet even in that oppressive stillness, small seeds of rebellion took root. The books I devoured in the one-room library, the questions I scribbled in the margins of my notebook, the fierce pride that rose in me the day I aced a math test, all were quiet defiance. I began to understand that the customs around me were not sacred, they were chosen, and sometimes they were wrong. As I prepare to tell the next chapter, how my mother found the courage to uproot our lives, and how in a new city I learned that survival sometimes means starting over. I carry those early lessons with me. They shaped my fears, yes, but they also revealed the strength that can grow in silence. And in that knowledge lies the path to reclaiming one's own voice. When my mother decided she'd had enough, the world seemed to shift beneath my feet. One stormy night, though, the only thunder was in our walls. She stood tall in the kitchen, her voice unsteady but firm. "Anthony, pack our things. We're leaving." I remember the metallic tang of fear in the air, how the shadows on the peeling wallpaper seemed to lean in, listening. My father's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered. I clutched my little brother Thomas's hand, surprised at the fierceness in my own grip. The next morning, we moved quietly, gathering 2 battered suitcases between us. I was 14. Thomas was 9. He stared at our house as if it were a creature bleeding out, unwilling to look away. He begged to stay with Daddy, tears splashing down his cheeks, and my mother's face broke in 2. Half sorrow, half steely resolve before she whispered to me, "You have to go. I'll take care of him later. Right now, you and I must be safe." I nodded, though my heart thudded so loud I was certain he'd hear. We took the Greyhound bus to Atlanta, and as the countryside blurred past the window, I felt a strange mixture of guilt, relief, and wonder. For the first time, we traded muddy dirt roads for asphalt highways lined with peach trees in bloom. My mother's sister, Aunt Constance, lived in a modest home in the Kirkwood neighborhood, clapboard siding a small chicken coop in back, and the scent of honeysuckle spilling through every open window. Aunt Constance was all hugs and gentle laughter. "You're safe here," she told us. Her hands warm on my shoulders. School in Atlanta was a revelation. I no longer had to hide my grades or pretend to be less than I was. My new teacher, Mrs. Elias, pried my books from my hands only to praise my notes. "Margaret, you have a gift," she said one afternoon, thumbs tucked into the pocket of her cardigan. "Don't ever let anyone dim that light." In those words, I felt something I'd never felt before: permission to shine. But the bright veneer of Atlanta life had cracks of its own. Thomas resented the change. He clung to the idea that Daddy was innocent. An idea grown-ups in our tiny town had encouraged, whispering that Josephine had been hasty, unreasonable. I tried to bridge the gap, taking him on impromptu walks to the wren's nest, telling him about Joel Chandler Harris and the world beyond our home. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he fled back inside. Nighttime was hardest. I missed the creak of our old front porch swing, even the way Daddy would call my name with that familiar drawl. I grew vivid dreams of his belt and Mom's frightened whisper, waking with my throat clenched. At first I tried to steel myself. I dared not tell Aunt Constance she'd handled so much already. But unspoken terror isn't soothed by silence. It festers like a wound. It was on one of those nights when I lay in bed, convinced I'd hear the river in Georgia rushing beneath my window, that my mother found me sobbing in the dark hallway. She wrapped me in her arms, stronger than I remembered, and said, "We did the right thing, baby girl. I wish I could take the nightmares for you." Her voice cracked like an old violin string, but she held me tight until dawn seeped through the curtains. Meanwhile, the legal machinery churned slowly. My mother filed for separation and custody in Fulton County. We learned about Child Protective Services, which in those days was a patchwork of detectives and social workers. But at least it existed. Aunt Constance stood by our side in every hearing. I wore my good church dress. Thomas refused to look at the judge. I hated the hush of the courtroom, the way my mother's attorney spoke of domestic instability as though we were a case file. Yet when we emerged, statements signed, protections granted, I felt a fragile relief. The court had acknowledged our truth, given us a sliver of safety to build on. But safety doesn't erase loss. Our small family had been torn in two, my mother and I in Atlanta, my father and brother in Georgia. Letters dribbled in short clipped updates about Thomas's grades, a mention of Daddy's health. He had taken to drinking less, they said, but the ache in my chest said differently. I ached for my brother, even as I clung to my freedom. After a year in Atlanta, my mother got a teaching job at a bigger elementary school, and I entered my freshman year of high school with cautious optimism. We made new friends, Latoya and Carla, whose families welcomed us into BBQs and Sunday picnics at the park. Mr. Nguyen, who ran the corner store and slipped me extra coins when I bought my lunch with crumpled bills. Slowly, the roots of our life dug into Atlanta's red clay. Yet every milestone, first school dance weekend trips downtown, carried an echo of what we'd left behind. I was haunted by a sensation I struggled to name, survivor's guilt, I'd later learn. Why had I escaped, and not Thomas? Why did my mother bear witness to the horror, and not me? These questions throbbed beneath the surface, complicating every triumph with a twinge of sorrow. 2 years later, my mother's job transfer pulled us north to Norfolk, Virginia. "It's closer to Constance if anything ever happens," she said, folding the packing list with care. Norfolk welcomed us with salt-tinged breezes and cedar-lined streets. The naval base loomed grandly in the distance, and I imagined ships sailing away, taking my nightmares with them. We moved into a neat bungalow in the Ghent neighborhood. Peach walls, brick walkway, a sunroom where I could watch the gulls fly over the Elizabeth River. Again, I started at a new school. Again, I carried my chestnut hair and shy smile under the watchful eyes of classmates. But here I felt the distance between us. The rowdy kids in camouflage club, the sailors' daughters with salty laughter. I learned to duck my gaze when someone mentioned Georgia. They meant the crisp mountains, not our broken home. I became an expert at small talk, weather homework, but never volunteered my past. I made friends with Ellen, who played guitar in the school's folk group, and James, whose grandfather served in Vietnam and taught me how to fold an origami crane. They both sensed my reserve, but neither pressed. In the mild winters, we'd walk to the lighthouse at Fort Norfolk, collecting driftwood to build a scrapyard diorama for art class. In those moments, I tasted normalcy. Still, my nights were restless. The nightmares followed me, images of walls closing in a belt, snapping voices demanding obedience. I'd wake in that sunroom, the dawn light softening the edges of my fears, but I couldn't outrun them. I tried pencil and paper journaling, pouring memories onto lined pages. I told myself I was working through it, but the act of writing made me feel shaky, as though each sentence reopened the wound. One spring afternoon, I missed the bus home and wandered into a community center. A flyer caught my eye. Teen Support Group Navigating Family Changes. I hesitated outside room 12, hearing laughter and hesitant voices. My mother had insisted I seek help, but I'd refused, worried what other kids would think. On a sudden impulse, I slipped inside. The group was a semicircle of folding chairs lit by a single window. 5 girls sat talking softly, sharing stories of divorce, relocation, tense parents. No one mentioned belts or broken plates, but I realized their quiet struggles mirrored mine. At my first meeting, I said little, listening to their voices, steadying as they spoke. By the third, I found myself saying, "My father. He wasn't always kind." The words felt like stones dropping into a pond, making ripples. When I looked up, the other girls nodded. Not pity, but recognition. Their experience didn't erase mine, but it made me feel less alone. That support group became an anchor. I learned coping tools, deep breathing when the chest tightens, writing letters. I never send learning to name emotions instead of stuffing them. I discovered that talking about shame doesn't magnify it, it shrinks it. Slowly, I faced the memory of that night when Mother took me away. Its terror became part of my story, not the whole story. By the time I turned 17, I walked across the stage at Norfolk High with a mix of shaky nerves and quiet pride. The principal handed me my diploma. My mother and Aunt Constance cheered from the front row. Thomas wasn't there. He'd finished school back in Georgia and gone straight to a trade school. But I pictured him, the little boy who once clung to our father, now growing up somewhere else. I hoped he too would find a path out of the darkness. As we celebrate each small victory, new school friendships, a supportive counselor, a spring full of blossoms, I remember the gift of that escape. My mother's courage, Uncle Augustus's fierce arrival, the kindness of strangers in Atlanta and Norfolk all conspired to give me a second chance. In the chapters ahead, I'll tell you how that chance led me to my deepest crisis, and ultimately to the tools that saved my life. But for now, let the winds of Virginia remind you that freedom can bloom even after the hardest winter. By the time I graduated high school in Norfolk, the relief I felt should have been triumphant. Instead, it was hollow. All around me, the class of '75 celebrated summer jobs and college acceptances, and I forced myself to smile as diploma in hand. Yet inside, I was a storm of old fears. I'd spent years running from that night back in Georgia, but I carried it with me like a stone in my pocket, cold, heavy, and impossible to discard. Within weeks, I found work as a receptionist at a modest beauty salon downtown. It seemed ideal, surrounded by laughter, surrounded by the promise of transformation. But each morning I forced myself to show up, hands trembling as I unlocked the front door. I answered the phone with a practiced cheeriness. "Good morning, Willow and Cone. How may I help you?" My voice sounded brittle, even to me. The stylists bantered behind me, steam rising from curlers, and I longed to join their easy camaraderie, but I was too busy policing my own thoughts. Every time someone asked how my day was going, I plastered on a smile and said, "Great," even though my chest burned. After a few months, the pressure began to show. I overslept. I missed shifts. I'd walk into the salon feeling waves of dread as though someone had whispered, "Here come the nightmares," before I stepped through the door. I tried breathing exercises, slow inhales counts to 10, but the panic wouldn't let go. So I reached for what seemed to offer a moment of relief, a glass of wine after work. Then 2 glasses, then a bottle. I told myself I deserved it. After all, I'd lived through things most people never imagined. Alcohol was my quiet accomplice, dulling the noise in my head. On evenings when no one else was home, I'd open the cabinet and pour whiskey neat into a coffee mug, then tip it back before sliding into bed. I remember the way the liquid burned going down, pain against pain, but at least it was swift. Soon, evenings turned into afternoons. I arrived at the salon straight from lunch, glassy-eyed, smelling of bourbon. The stylists exchanged worried glances, but said nothing. My mother, who still lived with me and struggled with the aftermath of her stroke, would find me passed out on the sofa and shake me awake with tears in her eyes. "Margaret, talk to me," she'd plead. My only answer was a slurred apology, followed by the rattling of ice in my secret mug. By the time I turned 19, my performance at the salon had cratered. I called in sick more days than I worked. My boss, Miss Willow, cornered me one Thursday morning. She was generous and kind, one of the few adults who treated me like a person rather than a project, a gar. "I'm worried about you," she said, her hands on my shoulders. "This isn't like you." I blinked back tears. Part embarrassment, part genuine fear that I was losing myself. "I'm fine," I lied, voice cracking. She shook her head, sadness in her eyes. "You need help. Please remember, you always have a place here if you choose recovery." I didn't call her back. Instead, I spiraled. I drank through dinner, drank before bed, woke at dawn, dizzy and paranoid. Shadows on the walls became threats. I trembled, thinking of male voices, imagining them hoarse in the darkness. Fabrics brushed my skin and felt like hands reaching. The terror was worse than the hangovers. One evening, after a particularly rough day, nights of insomnia, days of trembling, I got behind the wheel to drive myself to the nearest liquor store. The streets, blurred headlights, wobbled like floaters in my vision. I nearly crashed into a puddle from a broken hydrant. Rather than pull over, I gunned the engine and barreled through. That was the night I lost my job. Miss Willow called the salon and ordered me to stay out of the building. I realized afterward she'd sent the other stylists to check on me at home when I didn't show up for my shift. They found me asleep at the kitchen table, bottles strewn like casualties. They stayed long enough to help me to the couch and left a note on the counter. "Help is out there, Margaret. We care." Shame struck like lightning. I sat on that sofa staring at the note, wondering if I even cared about myself enough to fight. And then the floorboards above me creaked. I looked up to see Mr. Manuel, the building's janitor. He was an older man, salt and pepper hair, a wrinkled smile, and eyes so kind they looked like they'd been carved from warm wood. He carried a small box of cleaning supplies and paused when he saw me curled in a ball. "Miss Margaret," he asked gently, "you okay?" His voice was a soft chord of concern. "I'm fine," I muttered, wiping my eyes. He crouched beside me. "This life." "It's tricky sometimes," he said. "I've been here long enough to see good people fall. You got friends here. And me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 paper cups. "Coffee," he offered. I hesitated, then nodded. He poured from his thermos, handing me a cup. The coffee was hot and bitter, just the thing to help me breathe. He sat with me until the mug was empty. He didn't lecture. He didn't ask me to make promises I couldn't keep. Instead, he said, "One day at a time." Then he added, "There's a meeting tonight at Grace Church on Elm Street. They call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous. You might want to check it out." His tone wasn't pushy. It was hopeful, like the sunrise creeping through the grimy window above us. I didn't go that night. I thought he was being kind, but I wasn't ready to admit the truth. I was powerless over drink. And in that powerlessness, AA finds its first foothold. I kept drinking for 2 more days. I forgot how the world looked in daylight. I forgot how jeans felt without the weight of bottles tucked under my arm. Then I passed out on the kitchen floor. My mother found me pale and panting and called the ambulance. In the hospital waiting room, I sat beside her. The antiseptic smell made me cough, and I realized I was shaking uncontrollably with withdrawal. The doctor emerged, a young man with compassionate eyes. "She's dehydrated and experiencing tremors," he said. "We'll keep her overnight for monitoring." My mother's relief was immediate. At least someone was taking care of me. I felt a flicker of something. I don't know if it was fear or hope. That night, when the ward was quiet and the lights dimmed, I remembered Mr. Manuel's words. One day at a time. I hadn't wanted to face that meeting, but now fear had pushed me forward. The next evening, in a borrowed wheelchair, I was driven to Grace Church by my mother. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and candle wax, and a circle of chairs sat in the front, facing each other like a gathering of old friends. I sat on the edge of the circle, my hands clasped. 7 people turned in their chairs to greet me. They ranged in age from early 20s to grey-haired. No uniforms, no titles. One woman nodded and said, "Welcome. We're glad you're here." I whispered my name. "I'm Margaret." And they answered, "Hi, Margaret." Then someone said, "Who would like to share?" My throat clenched. I didn't want to speak, but a gentle voice beside me said, "You don't have to share today. Just listen." It was a man named Carl who'd been sober 30 years. I listened instead. A young man told of his first DUI. A grandmother described losing her grandson to neglect. A woman recounted her bout with prescription pills. Each story was different, but the same thread ran through: I was sick and didn't know how to stop. They all spoke of the moment they realized, I can't do this alone. Then they described turning to AA, choosing to live by the 12 steps, admitting powerlessness, believing in something greater than themselves, taking a moral inventory, making amends, helping others. When the meeting closed, they held hands and said the Serenity Prayer together. My chest ached. Tears slid down my cheeks. I realized I was hungry for community, for honesty, for the chance to rebuild a life not based on drowning pain, but on sharing it. Over the next weeks, I returned to AA meetings 3 times a week. I found a sponsor, Mrs. Helen, a retired schoolteacher who once lost everything to alcohol but rebuilt her life teaching ESL classes at the community center. She guided me through step 1, admitting powerlessness. I journaled my inventory, the shame I carried, the fights I ran from the trust I'd broken. I confessed to my mother, hung my misery before her eyes, and saw her relief. It hurt to say the words, but it felt like light pouring into a dark attic. Step 2 asked me to believe a power greater than myself could restore me. It wasn't about religion, it was about hope. I stood in my bedroom at dawn, arms outstretched, and whispered, "Please help me live." Sometimes I barely believed it. Sometimes I prayed with a cracked voice. But with each morning I woke sober. I felt a tiny flicker of faith. By the 3rd month, I began to notice changes. The tremors subsided. My sleep grew deeper, though dreams still came. But in daylight, I felt steadier. The salon owner, Miss Willow, invited me back part-time. I returned to the reception desk, handing out fresh magazines instead of balancing glass mugs. I honored my commitment to AA, leaving early on Wednesdays for meetings. My co-workers noticed my calm. "You look better," they said. I smiled uncertainly but thanked them. In therapy with Dr. Reed, a counselor specializing in trauma I faced that night in Georgia, we spoke of my father's betrayal, my brother's silence, the lifelong shadow it cast. I learned to name the fear that still sat at my collarbone, and to reframe it not as weakness, but as warning. I practiced grounding exercises, tracing the armrest's fabric, feeling my feet on the carpet, saying, "I'm safe now." Slowly, I built a new routine. Each morning, I greeted the sunrise on the front porch, coffee in hand. I meditated for 10 minutes, eyes closed, breathing in hope. I attended work, then an evening meeting, then came home to simple dinners with my mother. Step by step, I walked away from the darkness that once defined me. I will never forget the man who offered me coffee in a paper cup, or the circle of strangers who welcomed me without judgment. In their eyes, I discovered something I'd long forgotten: I was worthy of care. That realization ignited the path to reclaiming my life, a path I'll continue sharing with you. In the chapters ahead, I'll tell you how that sober foundation led me to rebuild my career, forge healthy relationships, and eventually transform pain into purpose. But tonight, as the moonlight filters through the living room window, I breathe in gratitude for every hand that lifted me, every word that soothed me, every prayer that saved me. One day at a time, I live. When I first set foot on Savannah soil in the summer of 1984, I carried nothing but a small suitcase, my mother's blessings, and the hard-earned lessons of 12 months in recovery. The city greeted me like an old friend I'd never met. Spanish moss draped over oak trees, the river glinting in the evening light, and cobblestone streets humming with memory. I rented a tiny storefront on Ardsley Park's cobbled sidewalk. Bare walls, two mismatched chairs, a single sink. In that emptiness lay possibility. I painted a sign in pale blue letters, Daisy Salon, after myself, and the resilient little flower that thrives on stubborn hope. The first weeks were brutal. I scraped together every penny for rent and utilities. Some days I scrubbed floors and arranged display bottles of shampoo, simply to learn the rhythm of the place. Clients trickled in, mostly polite neighbours, curious about the new stylist in town. I greeted each of them with the gentleness I had learned from Mrs. Helen in AA, a warm welcome, a steady eye, and the freedom to talk or be silent. Word spread slowly, but it did spread. One afternoon, Mrs. Green, a grandmotherly woman with silver hair, asked if I'd ever styled her daughter's wedding hair. She leaned close and whispered, "Darling, you've got magic hands. You listen like you care, and that's a gift." I felt a pinch in my chest. Had I truly transformed my pain into this gesture of care, I built my business not on aggressive advertising, but on storytelling. At the chair, I shared bits of my journey, how I learned to stand in my own light, how recovery taught me to value honesty, how every haircut could be a chance to help someone feel seen. I didn't overshare. I respected boundaries. But I offered enough vulnerability that my clients knew they'd found more than a stylist. They'd found a sanctuary. Mothers brought daughters seeking confidence. Widowers stopped in after a hard week at the shipyard. I learned names, remembered birthdays, sent handwritten thank you notes. In return, they brought friends, neighbours, even their barbershop men when Daisy Salon became known as a place where hearts mended as much as hair. Still, success didn't erase my wariness. I kept office hours, logged my recovery meetings, and refused to schedule appointments on AA nights. One slow Monday afternoon, the shampoo faucet sprung a leak. Water dripped in a steadfast rhythm, echoing in the quiet room. I called the number on a tattered business card I'd found under my sink months earlier, Joseph Sanders, handyman and barber. When he arrived, toolbox in hand, honest eyes scanning the damage, I felt the familiar flutter of uncertainty. What if this ended badly like before? But Joseph spoke softly, asked permission, before he moved anything, and hummed a gentle tune I'd later learn was an old gospel song. He finished the repair without charging me extra, declined my offer of coffee, and left with a nod that felt like respect. Days turned into weeks, and Joseph found reasons to return. Sometimes the dryer overran, sometimes the barber chair needed tightening. Sometimes he simply popped in to see how business was. After a while, he asked if I'd join him for a soda on the bench outside. I hesitated, old fears whispered I'd misstep, but I remembered the courage that had brought me here. We sat under a magnolia tree, the air thick with blooms, and talked about everything but hair. His late wife, who'd loved swing dancing, my small triumphs in sobriety, the peculiar light that makes Savannah's evenings feel like a watercolor painting. I realized as I listened that I was curious about him, not afraid. We began to date slowly, carefully. Joseph never pressured me for more intimacy than I could bear. He asked about my meetings, my therapist, my dreams for the salon. He shared his grief, his hopes for the future. When I spoke of my past, of that terrible night in Georgia, he listened without flinching. His hand covered mine with gentle assurance. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. Voice hushed. "I'll never take that for granted." In those words, I felt something I had once believed impossible: safety in another's arms. We learned each other's boundaries, as if exploring a garden path. There were evenings we walked beside the river shoulders brushing, but no more talking about the ships and the secret places where the tide ebbs. There were afternoons in the salon when he'd bring iced tea waiting in the back room while I finished a client, then sweeping up the hair on the floor without a word. He delighted in small gestures, holding my hand as we crossed a busy street, giving me space when a memory hit too sharply. Our relationship grew, not through grand declarations, but through countless acts of respect. I remember the afternoon he proposed. It was October 1989, and the azaleas in Forsyth Park glowed pink in the autumn sun. He led me to a wrought iron bench beneath a canopy of oaks and knelt, opening a simple ring box. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady. I wept not from sorrow, but because I was finally free to hope. I said yes, and he slid the ring onto my finger as a promise that love could be gentle, patient, and transformative. In the months that followed, I merged my salon with his barbershop on Bay Street, creating Sanders and Daisy, a truly unisex haven where everyone felt welcome. Our grand opening wasn't a lavish affair, it was a heartfelt celebration. Friends from AA brought cupcakes. Aunt Constance drove down from Atlanta with her ever-present smile. Clients from my old Norfolk days sent bouquets of daisies. We hung a sign that read, "Every cut, every color, every heart matters." The words weren't marketing fluff. They were our mission statement. Earning a living from something I loved and using it to serve others was a balm to my own wounded heart. I began to see the parallel between cutting away split ends and helping people shed emotional burdens. I encouraged clients to share stories if they wished, and I guided them toward resources if they needed help. I partnered with a local women's shelter, offering free haircuts to survivors of domestic violence. Each snip of my scissors became a small act of solidarity. Through this journey, I learned that trauma doesn't have to define your future. By building a career rooted in compassion, I honored my past without allowing it to chain me. And in opening my heart to Joseph slowly with care, I discovered that love can coexist with healing. It doesn't erase pain, but it illuminates new paths. Paths where two people support each other's recovery, where vulnerability becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. As we prepared to welcome our daughter into the world in 1991, I realized how far I'd come. The terrified girl who once believed her value hinged on staying small was now co-owner of a thriving salon, partner to a loving man, and ready to raise a child in a home filled with respect and understanding. My scars remained, but they no longer ached with shame. Instead, they stood as markers of resilience, guiding me to extend kindness to others. In the next chapter, I'll share how motherhood deepened my empathy, how the salon became a community cornerstone, and how together with Joseph, we transformed our modest shop into a legacy of hope. But before we turn that page, know this: building a career and a relationship after trauma is not about perfection. It's about showing up, listening deeply, setting boundaries, and celebrating each small victory one day at a time. The years that followed brought more blessings than I ever dared imagine. In August of 1991, our daughter Lucy arrived on a humid Savannah morning, her wail piercing the hush of the hospital room like a trumpet heralding a new dawn. When the nurse placed her in my arms, tiny, perfect, with a shock of dark fuzz on her head, I felt my heart unfurl in a way I'd never known possible. All the pain of my past, all the nights spent trembling, and the endless wanderings of my heart coalesced into that single moment of wonder. This child, so innocent, so pure, was both a testament to survival and a promise of renewal. Raising Lucy was a delicate dance between my old fears and my new determination. There were nights when her cry triggered a flash of panic, as though I could feel echoes of my own childhood terror pulsing through the air. But Joseph was always there, gentle in his reassurance, guiding me back to calm, with whispered reminders that our home was now a place of safety. "She's our world, Maggie," he'd say, brushing a curl from her forehead. "And you're her safe port." His faith in me bolstered my own resolve to break every chain that had once bound my spirit. In the early months, I balanced motherhood with the salon. I installed a little play area in the back room, a plush rug, a basket of wooden toys, and a framed photo of my mother smiling in her Norfolk bungalow. During nap times, I snipped away at split ends. During her morning feeding, I planned our next community outreach. My salon had grown beautifully. What once began as Daisy Salon and Sanders and Daisy had expanded into a bright, airy space on Bay Street, with 4 styling stations, 2 shampoo bowls, and walls painted in soft hues of blue and white. It was there, in that warm, bustling workshop of transformation, that I discovered my truest purpose. I'd always seen hair as more than just strands. Each cut, color, and curl carried a story. Now I saw that clients who had suffered trauma, whether from domestic abuse, addiction, or simply the wear of time, came to us not only for beauty, but for healing. With Joseph's encouragement, I partnered with Women's Haven, a local shelter for domestic violence survivors. One Saturday each month, we opened our doors for free haircuts, styling, and gentle conversation. Survivors arrived with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. They left standing taller with new dues and the knowledge that someone cared. Watching them smile in the mirror, that fleeting miracle reminded me of my own journey from fear to freedom. As Lucy grew, so did her curiosity. At age 4, she insisted on playing with my combs and scissors, under careful supervision, of course, and would arrange toy dolls in neat rows, styling their yarn hair. I watched her small hands fumble with the tools, and I saw in her the same fiery spark that once drove me to excel in school and to dream beyond my circumstances. When I told her the story of how I started this business, she looked up at me with big brown eyes and asked, "Mama, you were brave, weren't you?" I nodded, my voice thick. "I was scared, sweetheart. But bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do with that fear." She hugged me fiercely, and I felt pride swelling in my chest. Pride not only for what I'd overcome, but for the new generation of hope she represented. In 1998, when my mother passed away quietly in her sleep at age 71, I experienced a grief that wound around my heart like ivy. Mrs. Eunice, my kind neighbor from Norfolk, flew down, and we sat together on my front porch, sharing memories of laughter, tears, and the countless times my mother had saved me with a single phrase: "It wasn't your fault, baby." That truth had been her gift, and now it was mine to carry forward. I planted a magnolia tree in her honor in my backyard, a living tribute whose blossoms would perfume the air every spring, reminding me that love endures beyond death. By the early 2000s, Joseph and I began to consider slowing down. The salon was humming with talent stylists we'd trained who embodied our values of compassion and excellence. In 2005, we hired our first salon manager, allowing me to step back from day-to-day operations and focus on mentoring new stylists and deepening our community programs. Joseph continued to whittle away at the barbering chair, though his hands bore the first tremors of arthritis. In January 2007, we opened a small annex at the back of the shop, a cozy counseling corner where survivors of trauma could meet with licensed therapists free of charge. We teamed up with Savannah Hope Center and hosted monthly workshops on self-esteem, coping strategies, and creative expression through art and movement. Meanwhile, Lucy flourished into a bright, empathetic young woman. At age 16, she confided that she intended to study psychology, drawn by the story she'd grown up hearing about Dr. Cecilia, the kind psychologist who had listened without judgment. "I want to help people like you help them," she told me, voice earnest and determined. In the summer of 2009, she was accepted into the Savannah College of Art and Design's psychology program. I wept tears of joy and relief, knowing that the cycle of pain had given way to a new cycle of healing. Joseph and I celebrated with a quiet dinner on the river's edge, toasting to our daughter's future and the unfolding promise of her dreams. In October 2015, at age 58, I officially retired from the salon chair, though I still popped in once a week to greet loyal clients and offer advice. Joseph followed suit in 2017 when his arthritis made barbering a physical challenge. We transformed his old barber chair into a display and anchor of our shared history and created a small reading nook for clients to browse books on recovery empowerment and personal growth. The salon's motto evolved to a simple phrase painted above the sink: beauty through resilience. Our days settled into a peaceful rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch under the magnolia tree. Midday, walks through Forsyth Park afternoon book club with local seniors and evening conversations over tea, reminiscing about the people we'd met and the lives we'd touched. We travelled when we could. Charleston's waterfront, Asheville's mountain trails, but always returned to Savannah's gentle embrace. When the pandemic of 2020 swept through, we worried for our community. Joseph, then 75, faced heart surgery, while Lucy, now a budding therapist, rallied efforts to provide virtual counseling for survivors in isolation. From our living room, I recorded messages of encouragement, sharing breathing exercises and stories of hope. We distributed care packages through Women's Haven sanitizer journals and handwritten notes, reminding recipients that they were not alone. Through it all, our family bond held firm, a testament to the love that had weathered storms and carried us forward. In October 2022, Lucy and her husband Frank welcomed their first child, our granddaughter Mary Helen. When I held her so small, so new, I thought of the girl I once was trembling in that Georgia hallway, and the woman I had become, a grandmother, a mentor, and a healer. Joseph, tears in his eyes, whispered, "She's the light of our legacy." I nodded, overwhelmed by gratitude that life had come full circle. Now, at 68, I sit on my front porch each morning with tea in hand, watching the sunrise light the river. Savannah's streets hum softly with possibility. I see young mothers pushing strollers, veterans walking dogs, artists sketching the Spanish moss-draped oaks. In each face, I recognize resilience, the same resilience that lifted me from fear. I share my story not to dwell on pain, but to illustrate one undeniable truth: even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength. Each chapter of my life, crawling through trauma, finding sobriety, building a sanctuary for others, has led me here to a place of peace and purpose. The magnolia blossoms serve as reminders that, like these blooms, we too can emerge beautiful and fragrant after the harshest winters. So to you who listen, may you carry in your heart the knowledge that your scars are not marks of shame, but of survival. May you find your community, be it a circle of friends, a support group, or the branches of a loving family, to help you stand when your knees grow weak. And may you remember that every small act of courage, speaking your truth, seeking help, offering kindness, becomes a ripple of change reaching further than you ever dreamed. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If my story has touched you, I invite you to share it with someone who needs to hear: a friend in darkness, a neighbor in despair, a stranger who feels unseen. Because when we turn our scars into bridges instead of barriers, we build a world where no one walks alone. And that, my dears, is the greatest legacy of all.